Welcome internet users yet another day here in Mauritius South. My name is Sengetiwe Simelane from Swaziland. Here I'll be having three most important guests talking questions related to ecology and how we relate to ecology. I hope you'll be very much delighted to hear about it. Firstly, we're going to be having Mr. Brian Ashley talking about extractivism and what it is and how do we relate to it as a whole continent and globe. We are so honored for having you and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to be with you.
Since today we're going to be talking about extractivism and what it really is and how does it relate to ecology. But before we start, could you please enlighten our internet users what extractivism is?
Yeah, it's a mode of production. It's a process of exploitation of natural resources by mostly big multinational corporations that expropriate those natural resources. We're talking about minerals, we're talking about crops, we're talking about livestock, we're talking about fish. So it involves industrial agriculture, it involves mining, gas, oil, it involves forestry, fisheries, etc. And it's the extraction of those natural resources and the destruction that happens with it as these natural resources are exported out of our zones, out of our countries, and are taken both in the form of the actual mineral or fish or wood, etc., but also with the finances that surround those processes. So extractivism goes hand in hand with the export of capital out of our countries, leaving us and leaving our societies completely underdeveloped and devastated.
Very well said, Mr. Ashley. But although those countries are given jobs, would you say that them having jobs part-time is a way for them to benefit, or are they also being exploited while working in those very own mines, as you said before?
No, I mean, they are not only exploited, they are super exploited. They work for very low wages, they work under tremendously difficult circumstances. They don't often have proper working conditions. The owners of these mines and farms and forests, etc., do everything to reduce the costs of labor because that would then increase their profits. So along with the extraction of natural resources goes the devastation of working people and their circumstances, creating a social crisis in our societies.
Which other social crises would you mean economically or other situations such as the state not having any development?
Well, look, I mean, if you have a situation of the exportation of your wealth out of your country, of course, the state then has very little resources with which to deal with the social problems that people have. Because our societies in an extractivist economy have characteristics of mass unemployment, poverty, and extreme environmental damage. So we need to have more hospitals, we need more clinics, we need social welfare for the unemployed, all of those things. And of course the state doesn't have the resources for that, partially because of the situation that I'm describing, but also because in very many instances the state itself is explicit in the extractivist process because they are the ones that open up our economies to the multinational corporations and transnational corporations to do the exploitation, etc. So what we see is the consequences of deprivation and the decline of our societies, the neglect, so that we have no budget for the most important things that people require.
Very well said, Mr. Ashley. But my main concern is that should we just say the capitalists are the one exploiting, or should we also involve the state, because the state is the one allowing them to come to the countries and start the extraction of minerals and other etc. etc.?
Well, that's precisely the point I was making, that the states are obviously complicit, but that's not sufficient for us. We must say, what is the context in which the states open up our economies and allow for the extractivist logic to play itself out? And I think there we've got to go back all the way to the impact of colonialism, the underdevelopment of our societies, the way in which our economies are locked into a world economy where we are the producers of raw materials, which then are processed in other parts of the country, and we then have to export. Now that process sees export of capital. So we are constantly losing wealth through this process. So that loss of wealth puts states under pressure, because the state needs to be able to deliver to the needs of the people. Now, in the post-colonial period, you had an initial process in which the state concentrated on literacy, developing the health services which were denied under colonialism, etc. But as that process unfolded, you also had a process of co-optation, because the multinational corporations that were there and developed under colonialism continued to dominate the global economy and our own economies. And so in that process, of course, the question of the co-optation of the leadership of our liberation movements, the anti-colonial movements, etc., as junior partners in the exploitation of the natural resources, because they realized that they also wanted to become wealthy and make money in the capitalist economies that we started to construct. The idea of a post-capitalist society, which was uppermost in many struggles for liberation, waned, was eroded, and was corrupted through this process of domination by multinational capital and the big powerful states in the north.
Wow, very well said. So if we're the victims, what are we supposed to get ready to do? Are we supposed to engage or confront the state as well as the people that exploit us?
Well, look, people are resisting all the time. We can see from all parts of Africa, if we'll go to Ogoniland, people are resisting the way in which oil is extracted out of Nigeria. And they're fighting for their rights, they're fighting for their human rights, they're fighting for control over their environment, they are asserting their right to say no. We don't want to be consulted about your development projects. We have the right to say no. And we see resistance of workers who are striking, who are fighting in order to get a decent wage, and so on and so forth. So these are very, very important struggles that tell us that this process of extractivism is not sustainable. It is causing polarization in our societies, and it's causing conflicts. And our responsibility, understanding the damage that extractivism is doing to our society, is to organize that resistance, not just in a single area or around a single issue, but to connect these issues, connect the local to the global, the micro to the macro. The struggle for water, clean water, must be connected to the entire system around which that water is denied to people. That means we've got to try and make the links to the way in which the international economy operates. We've got to understand that the multinational corporations are aided in their work through international financial institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and the World Trade Organization. These institutions have a hold over our economies, because very often our society, our economy, our countries are indebted. We have to go and find ways in which we can borrow capital, and that relationship where we have to borrow, places us under a great leverage where conditions are imposed on us. In other words, conditions that often translate into the further opening up towards extraction of our natural resources. So they impose conditions in trade agreements, they impose conditions in loan agreements, and so we have things like structural adjustment programs that when countries like Zambia are indebted, they are forced to withdraw subsidies from for transport. They've got to give tax breaks to the multinational corporations. They've got to amend their labor legislation to make it easier to exploit workers. They've got to withdraw environmental regulations so that the costs of extractivism is not something that the multinational corporations have to bear, but the people themselves.
So truly, we are suffering from being exploited. But you were talking about linking. We're talking about creating not just one or different organization where we're trying, but creating a unity where one organization is going to try and make a movement together, because making movement together is a way of succeeding rather than being an individual and fighting the system alone.
No, absolutely. I think, when you resist, you need power, you need numbers. They've got weapons, they've got armies, they've got police forces, and they control the media. So in resisting, we can't resist individually and often even organizationally. One organization, a trade union, an environmental organization, a women's organization, a peasant organization isn't sufficient. We must build unity amongst all these different parts of our society that are affected by extractivism, and we've got to build a common front so that we have sufficient force to resist the onslaught that is against us. And I think that's the important point to understand, that it's a massive onslaught, because whereas maybe 20, 30 years ago our governments might have been more reluctant to facilitate in an open and direct way, now it's just opening up and allowing for our natural resources to be absolutely expropriated.
Thank you so much. Since you know so much about extraction, which are some key organizations which are trying to make a difference and you would encourage people to join or read articles on?
Look, I think that around the world today, we are in a much weaker position than we were when in the beginning of this century, in 2001, 2002, we formed a thing called the World Social Forum. We formed the World Social Forum because the multinationals and their governments had formed a thing called the World Economic Forum. That World Economic Forum meets every year in Switzerland and plots the way in which they can dominate all parts of the world to ensure the maximization of profits. And so movements got together and they formed a counterpower to the World Economic Forum. It was this World Social Forum that brought thousands of different organizations, local community organizations, grassroots movements with powerful trade unions and peasant organizations and so on and so forth. We don't have the World Social Forum in the same way as we had it in 2002. There's been a big erosion of the strength of popular movements for various reasons. But so we've really got to start again. We've got to start at the grassroots. We've got to start locally, work tirelessly at a local level, but constantly looking at how we can build solidarity with our counterparts in other parts of the world. So when people are struggling for water in Mauritius, we have to be in solidarity even though we may be in South Africa or in Swaziland. We have to look at existing networks like La Via Campesina, like the World March of Women, like the Rural Women's Assembly. And we've got to strengthen these movements and bring them together. We've got to bring together the trade union movement, which is a very big weakness of ours today, because the trade unions are much weaker than they were 20, 30 years ago. And they're weaker because of the very system that has been intensifying and ensuring that greater levels of super exploitation of workers. So the rights that workers had many years ago have been eroded by processes of globalization, where you're now having to organize inside your country, but you're faced with cheap products coming from China, for example. So there's a kind of race to the bottom that countries are involved in, because if investment is going to China rather than Swaziland, what do? You say, okay, well, what will it take to bring the investment here? I must also give tax breaks to the multinationals like they do. I must also ensure that workers don't strike. I must also ensure that workers are super exploitable, etc. That means taking away rights. That means ensuring that we prioritize informal forms of labor rather than permanent workers with rights, etc. So these are the challenges that we have in building movements. But we know from history that we go through these cycles of upturns in struggles like we had in 2011, 2012, where you could think that all around the world revolutionary processes were unfolding. We had the occupation movements in Europe. We had the big rise of anti-austerity movements in different parts of the world. We had the struggle for land, and the struggle against war and imperial domination, etc. So that was a big cycle. We had the Arab Spring, which was extremely important. Millions of people in the Middle East took to the streets to fight against neoliberalism. That type of mode of regulation where you give maximum rights and possibilities to the corporations and nothing to the people themselves. So it's in this context that we must see the current decline in organization as a temporary thing. And what our responsibility, and that's why we have schools like the School of Ecology and political education processes, is to prepare the next layer of activists to be able to link and build solidarity inside their countries and as a basis for solidarity at an international and global level. Because we have to know that our struggle cannot be won in our own localities any longer. We have to see the way in which global capitalism works today. It requires a level of international solidarity that we haven't seen in the past.
Well, that means that solidarity does go in hand with the people and ecology. Thank you for bringing that up, Mr. Ashley. So I don't know what to say. You just, cover the whole thing very well. I am surprised myself, but I was wondering to ask, since we are forming individual organizations, we don't have social forums, like something which is globe, something which is like international. Are they seeing that, or are trying to make any aims of bringing those organizations back, the one that we had back then in 2001?
Yeah, there's a lot of thinking going ahead and a lot of organizing around this. You see, with extractivism, it is pursued by right-wing governments. And the more right-wing, the more they don't care about the consequences of extractivism. In fact, we can say today that there is a sort of genocidal agenda of those who are in command of our economies and societies today. And so what we have is a number of people in different parts of the world saying, actually, we cannot take democracy for granted. We've got to come together and defend democracy because it's under threat from Donald Trump and from other right-wing forces in the world. Not just right-wing, extreme right-wing, whose agenda is to first other people. And when you're other people, when you're and that's why we see this rise of the right wing going together with a rise of racism, so that you kind of cast people as lower caste, lower of less value, etc. Because when you do that, then you can rationalize extermination, etc. So people are coming together to say, how do we fight this attack on democracy? How do we deal with the rise of a kind of fascistic movement, which we haven't seen at this scale since the 1930s, almost 100 years ago. But this is the cycle that we are in. And then we have another very interesting discussion taking place in the context of the genocide in Palestine. You've had a massive growth of a Palestinian solidarity movement all around the world. But with that Palestinian solidarity movement has also been the rise of a peace movement. People are saying what we have is not an isolated case of a war in Ukraine or an isolated case of a war in Gaza or a civil war in different parts of the world, Sudan, and so on and so forth. What you have is a slide towards war as a way of resolving the crises that capitalism have created. And so we need to rebuild an anti-war movement and a peace movement. And I think these things have the possibility of coming together. And so it's absolutely important that when we fight extractivism, we don't do it as a single issue. We see it as linked to the questions of war and peace and solidarity.
Wow. I think, Mr. Ashley, you've covered everything. Thank you for joining us here. It was a pleasure having you. That will be it. Well, fellow internet users, here we have it from Mr. Ashley. If you find it very, very key, please hit on the comments below or try to search about the ecology school, political ecology school that usually takes place in Mauritius.
Mi udine nauritanic